I'd like to say a few words of introduction about Dr. Jan Pronk. Dr. Pronk also has a resume which is so rich that it would take, I think, at least 30 minutes to do the presentation of him. So what I will do instead is just mention some of the highlights. Dr. Jan Pronk is a Dutch politician and a diplomat. Currently, he's a professor of theory and practice of international developments at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. Between 1973 and 2002, he has served 3 terms as Minister for Development Cooperation and 1 term as Minister of Housing, Spatial Planning and the Environment in the States General for the Labour Party. From 2004 until 2006, he was the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of Mission for the United Nations Mission in Sudan. So as you can see, his experience really is international. On the one hand in The Hague, on the one hand for his own country, but also at the global level through the United Nations. So I think it's really a perfect individual to give the keynote address on the topic that he has chosen, which is from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Dr. Jan Pronk. Thank you.
Thank you. I've chosen this subject in particular because these 2 weeks are the weeks of the major United Nations World Conference on Environment and Development, Rio +20. They don't get that much attention as the previous World Conference on Development and Environment, but it is a major occasion. Let me go back to the 1950s and 60s. At that time we had 2 major issues in international development policy making. First, a growth target. Developing countries ought to increase their economic level with, it was agreed worldwide, at least 5% per annum. If that would happen within a rather reasonable period, they would be able to double their level of living. That was the target set at the end 50s. And the second target related to this was they have to be helped with development assistance, and that should amount to, at the time it was said, 0.7% of the income of the donor countries. There was a relation between the 2 targets. Some countries have been able to meet the growth target. Many did not, but some have surpassed that target. I'm not going into details, it would go too much into the major factors behind economic growth and economic development. Hardly any country on the other side of the world has met the contribution target, the development assistance target, the 0.7%. On the whole, over a couple of decades, the average was about 0.3, far below the promise. For decades. And at the same time, while in many developing countries growth increased, many people stayed poor. And you may even say that gradually the inequality between those who were at the better side of the dividing line and those who were leaving behind increased. Inequality increased greatly since the beginning of the 1980s. And poverty remained more or less the same, and there was also demographic growth. More people at the end of the 1990s, 30 years later, in the world were poor than we started our development cooperation activities. Targets had been set. No child should go to bed without hunger, for instance, with a poverty indicator, but those targets were not met. And around the year 2000, world leaders came together, change of the millennia, and adopted a World Millennium Declaration. What to do in the next millennium. And that declaration still is a very worthy, readable document. I'd advise you, read the text. One element, only one element, was to agree on the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals were 7. I'm not going to mention all of them, but they came together into one. and that was because we did not succeed on the basis of the strategies of the past, we are now going to set another target. And that is the target to decrease world poverty with 50%, so to halve it, in a period of 15 years. And there were some indicators. For instance, one example, if there is a specific percentage in a country of the people of young children dying before the age of 5 years, say if, for instance, 40% of all children are dying before they get 5 years old, which is a target, which is an indicator which was indeed representative for quite a few countries. In 15 years, no longer 40%, but only 20% of the children should die before they reach the age of 5 years. One example. So you have poverty target to do that within 15 years. Well, we are very close to the end of that period, 2015. And you can say that globally we have not been able to meet that target. Some countries did. Of course, it is difficult to understand all statistics. And you may say for the world as a whole, in particular the fact that within China, quite a very strong anti-poverty policy has been rather successful, and that counts together with, of course, a huge country with all the other countries. But for the world as a whole, we have not been able to meet that target, far from it. And we are now 3 years before the end of that period. The Millennium Development Targets were different from everything before, you should understand, because firstly, and that was new, it was an output target, really an output target. Also for world cooperation. The whole idea was no longer we go for more development assistance, yes, that's important, but we do it in order to reach an output target, an impact target, a success, a performance target. One thing. That was new. Secondly, it was direct, not through growth, on the basis of the idea that economic growth will trickle down in order to benefit people. We had come to the conclusion, we knew of course, but we had always forgotten, that there is no trickling down effect which is really effective. So it is a direct output target, poverty reduction. And there were no other targets in the year 2000 which were quantified and specific. So it was a focus on something which was essential. Poverty, human existence in a dignified way is the essential thing. And that was also new, because world leaders had never before agreed that this ought to be the case. It was precise, it was quantified, it was essential, it was direct, and it was output performance related. And you may also say it's ambitious. To halve it in 15 years is quite an ambitious target. It was deemed to be ambitious, but also on the basis of analysis, feasible, possible. And despite that, as I said, it was not met. During the last couple of years, when we are going very fastly now towards that end year of 2015, more and more development experts are criticizing the targets. We're not meeting the target because it was not possible to meet the target. We are not meeting the target because they were only targets and there were no common strategies agreed. There are many development analysis-based criticisms on those targets. And that means that we are now nearing a period whereby it seems to be accepted more or less that we can't meet that target. Forget it, we start something new. But that is what we always did in the past. We had set so many targets, the targets were not met, and then we said, well, forget it, we start just something new. Analytically, that may seem to be based on ongoing insights into the character of processes. Politically, it's wrong. because it was a target set at the highest political level, not in a bureaucratic fashion. It was the result of many meetings and conferences, such as the conference which are going to take place next week in Rio. We had many of these before. It was a promise. We made mistakes. We are ashamed. Now we are going to do better. It was a promise and it was a commitment. The political dimension of target setting is extremely important, because if you are not meeting the targets, you are not the victim. If you are a political leader, no, those who were really the target of the target setting will be the victim. And you may say that if for decades and decades targets had not been met, if this major new breakthrough target is not going to be met, and then at a certain moment we are going to say, well, forget it, people rightly may feel betrayed. The political dimension is extremely important of the target setting. So my plea is that for the years ahead we would focus on the following. Firstly, it is extremely important to, on a country-by-country basis, to do everything, we have another 3 years, in terms of policy making, to focus on that specific target. To do our utmost to intensify policies in terms of budgetary support, budgetary allocation within countries, to go for poverty reduction as much as possible, as directly as possible, in terms of our health policies, in terms of our education policies, in terms of our rural development policies. Focus in particular on a decrease of poverty within the country. Now, you may say it's hardly possible within 3 years, but please do understand the political significance also of domestic resources mobilization and reallocation in order to reach that overriding target. To do so country by country and also internationally. If a goal has not been met, you have to intensify your policies in order to do so. Second important political comment to be made is the following. Of course, many politicians are saying, well, we did mean it. However, in the meantime, we got war in our country. Or in the meantime, climate change has made life much more difficult to us than we thought in the 1990s. Or thirdly, there is an economic crisis. And we have to meet the economic crisis first before we can think of the poor. That's the same attitude as we always had. We set a target, we find an excuse on the basis of so-called exogenous factors, a crisis, climate change, not to do our utmost to try to meet that specific target. And if you go back to that text of the year 2000, you will see that there was no condition mentioned. Politicians, world leaders agreed, now we are going to do it, whatever the conditions are. We of course are also, and that's why we were dealing with many different issues in the same Millennium Development Declaration to address other issues, but meeting other objectives was not made a condition to go for this overriding target. And the third important political comment which has to be made is the following. Of course, it's a global target. And never in the Millennium Development Declaration we see a statement that this is only for developing countries. No, it is for all countries. There is poverty also, and you may say even increasing poverty in many Western countries. Maybe also due to the character of economic growth at the moment. Maybe due to the crisis, whatever. There is poverty in many countries, and to a certain extent poverty is indeed even increasing in a number of Western countries. And Western countries have exactly the same obligation, commitment, to go for poverty reduction first, and the rest will follow. And fourth important political comment Never, it has been said around the year 2000, that developing countries would only have to meet their target if they would get assistance from other countries to do so. So it was not based on receiving adequate forms of development assistance. No, poverty reduction is a first commitment within your own country. You have the responsibility to protect your people, to secure your people, to give your people a human, decent existence, irrespective of the fact that you are being helped or not by the outside world. The outside world has the commitment to help other countries to do so, but if the help is not adequate, you should not change your own priorities within your own country. And fifth important political component, it was a very ambitious target, but it was feasible. But what about the other half? If now we would say, well, we couldn't and we can't and we're going to redirect our political attention to other issues, what about the other 50%? Because it was never meant, of course, in the year 2000 that we would only halve poverty and we would forget the other half of that percentage of the world population, which was in a very difficult situation, which means below decent existence. Poverty indicators, of course, were discussed, and at that time, in the year 2000, one of the major indicators, which is questionable, was that you were poor if you would have $1 a day to live upon, which was a not very ambitious indicator in itself, because it is hardly possible, even in Rwanda, to live on the basis of $1 a day. But if we would have chosen $2 a day as an indicator, of course, it would have been an even more ambitious target. And you will understand that indeed still a huge amount of world population is living, despite economic growth in many countries, without any decent access to their own livelihoods. 1/3 of the world population either doesn't have access on a day-to-day basis to clean, accessible water, or does have access to sanitation provisions which provide them a healthy life in the future. And there is a relation between not having access to water and not having access to sanitation, and thus not having access to the basic provisions for primary health care, just to mention an example. And that has consequences still for instance, maternal death in many countries. If you are, as a woman, having the luck of being born in a Western country, say here in Germany, or in, say, Chad, then your chances that you will survive if you bear a child are 100 times in Germany than in Chad. Well, in order to mention just an example of an indicator which is still quite significant. So what about the other half? We have set those targets, and we have to live up in one way or another to meet those targets. For the years ahead, of course, it is important to focus in particular on policy making, not try to make the targets more complicated, to focus on policy making, and in particular on policy making which is country specific, because we have dealt with so many overall general models and systems how to deal with the problem of growth and development and poverty reduction. All situations are different in all individual countries. All countries are different, all regions within countries are different. It's very important to be as specific in our policy making as far as the specific situation of the country itself is concerned. Countries can learn from each other, of course, on the basis of best practices analysis, but they have to apply a policy which is oriented to their own specific situation. And it is extremely important that as far as the international community is concerned, say a donor country like mine or Germany, or an international organizations like the World Bank or the United Nations, that those partners should only advise, and should not impose specific policies and should not set specific conditions. Now, the world post-2015, of course, is different already from the world post-2000 in itself. And we will have to do more than dealing with poverty, though it is still the overriding objective to be dealt with. Don't fool yourself that poverty will go away just by focusing on the attack on the world economic crisis or on an increase of economic growth. So in the agenda for the years after 2015, after that period which was set, we will have to focus on many more issues. We will have to focus on economic policies and on other policies which are oriented towards the well-being of future generations, which is much more important than we did in the past. As a matter of fact, during the last couple of decades, we have gone through policies shifting perhaps the risks of those policies onto a future generation on the basis of the idea that the future generations would benefit also from technological breakthroughs which would enable them also to solve the problems which we were creating for them, for instance, by means of climate change, which is quite a risk. We have to be much more cautious. So in our policies after 2015, we will have to incorporate much more in an overall approach future generations, peace and stability, biodiversity conservation, and also economic stability as major targets for our policies. And what we have to do is also to set some specific quantifiable objectives with regard to all the other major issues. But they have not to be agreed upon just at the world political level, but they should be the result of a process whereby stakeholders, civil society movements, country by country should be involved. It is important to take a couple of years to set agreed targets for all the other issues in order to have an overall strategy. And I very much hope that the Rio Plus 20 conference can be the beginning of such a new process. It is extremely important that in particular with regard to three issues, we will have to follow an approach which is more coherent. We have to decrease inequality in addition to only attack poverty. And inequality at the moment is increasing. We have to focus on policies which are aimed to address the root causes of conflict, because in many countries conflicts are increasing. There is discussion about so-called fragile countries, and other countries. There is a basic fragility and instability in nearly all countries in the world. Many countries which we thought would be rather stable. Who thought that Senegal? Who thought that Ivory Coast, when we were discussing these issues in the year 1990, would be as unstable as they seem to be now, and it could go much further. We have to increase our attention to all the basic elements of instability and fragility, otherwise we would miss the target. And we will have to go for policies which will not impoverish people. There is the need for a basic safety net and a basic minimum. For the first time, for instance, in the history of the European Union, since the 1950s, we are carrying out policies which make people poorer than they were before. What we said was a wrong policy of the International Monetary Fund with regard to adjustment policies, we are now applying ourselves within Europe with regard to people in many southern countries, to start with Spain and Greece. Those issues and others are extremely important for the years ahead. And then my final point. There is a relation, of course, between these targets and international financial targets. As I said, in 1960, between economic growth in developing countries and the official development assistance target. It was a simple relation based on a very simple model. Objectives are manifold. I call them sustainable development goals with regard to climate change, with regard to biodiversity, etc., in addition to the Millennium Development Goals, which have to be intensified in terms of their own implementation. We need international assistance, but not just development assistance from rich to poor countries. We need a system whereby official development assistance is going to be extended into international income transfers, international resources transfers to meet many different policy targets, from official development assistance to sustainable development contributions, from ODA to SDC, in order to help all countries to meet a number of objectives which cannot be dealt with by individual nations alone. World public goods conservation, for instance, climate change redress, the adjustment to the consequences of climate change, which is taking place anyway, despite what we are trying to do in order to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. We have to do so, which does not mean less international transfer. It has to mean more international contributions in order to enable ourselves and all other countries to meet objectives in the interest of mankind. Thank you.